And once again, good morning, church. The decorations and the calendar tell us that we've entered the season of Advent. That's a wonderful time to prepare our hearts for Christmas. It's even more important than preparing your decorations or your shopping lists or your Christmas travel plans. There really isn't a better time to be thinking about what it means to be a Christian, to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. This Advent, we'll be listening to each of the four Gospels as each of the Gospel writers tells us what he wanted to emphasize about the most wonderful, the most powerful, the most meaningful story the world has ever heard. And I've been thinking about stories recently. In our world today, filled as it is with a host of entertainment options, we tend to think of stories as something that's made up, a fictional tale that springs from the imagination of an author. But if I asked you to tell me your favorite Christmas story from your family's history, you wouldn't be making something up. You'd simply be telling the narrative of what happened. Now, perhaps you'd highlight one part of what happened that you thought was particularly important or significant or amusing. And you might leave parts out that someone else in your family recalled because those parts didn't impact you quite as much as they impacted, say, your brother. Or if you happen to be the person in the family who was known for being dramatic, you might tell the story in a slightly different way. Starting in the middle and going right up to the point just before the climax, and then stopping and going all the way back to the beginning to show what led up to the heart-stopping or hilarious finish. And your brother's dry and dull three-sentence summary of the matter might be less thrilling to listen to, but both accounts could honestly be said to be truthful reports of the famous incident in your family's Christmas album. The same is true of the Gospels. Each of them sets out to do the same thing, to present to the readers a picture of what happened when Jesus of Nazareth came into the world. They tell his story, along with what they have come to understand was the significance of that story, and more importantly, to let us know who he was, who he is. Much of what they say overlaps. We might expect that, since they're telling the story of a real person on the basis of eyewitness testimonies from his closest followers, including two of the gospel authors. But each of them brings out different features of his life, different emphases in his teaching, points out different but complementary and coherent aspects of what was so significant about this man, this otherwise obscure teacher from Galilee. For instance, only two of the gospel writers tell us directly about the events leading up to and including his birth. But the other two gospel writers are not ignorant of his birth. They simply start the story in a different place because they have a particular purpose for the way they are telling the story. We're starting our journey in John's gospel, the last of the four to be composed and to be published. John tells us quite clearly what his purpose in writing was. He says in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John is writing his account of the life and the teachings of Jesus so that everyone who reads it will understand who Jesus was and will have sufficient evidence to conclude that they should believe what he said and entrust themselves to him. And they will have life as a result. It's a life, John says, that's only found in his name, which means being identified with him, claiming his name as the name by which you will be known, the name that defines you and defines your family and defines your relationship to God. Now, John was already an old man when he put all the pieces of his gospel together as a single story. But he'd been telling those pieces and more to the churches for decades. He'd been ruminating on their importance, their meaning for over 50 years before he put it all together to give to the churches for a lasting memorial, a testimony from one of Jesus' first disciples who was now the last living apostle from the 12. And if we want to get the sense of what John was trying to do, what he was trying to say, we have to imagine him as a great-grandfather sitting with all of his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren after a special meal, a festival perhaps, or a weekly agape for the church. And one of the young ones asks him, "Abba John, tell us a story." "Yes, Abba John, tell us a story. Tell us about Jesus." Yes. And he pauses to think. There's so much to tell. More wonders than the world could ever imagine, much less believe or understand. Where should I start? And then there's a clamor. Everyone wants to tell him what to do. Tell us how you met him. Tell us when you first saw him. Tell us the whole story from the start. "Yes, Abba John, tell us the story from the beginning." From the beginning. And he pauses again, deep in thought. The beginning. In the beginning. You all know what happened in the beginning, yes, children? Of course they do. And everyone in the room instinctively begins to recite, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." It is the opening verse of Genesis, the introduction to the whole of Torah, the fundamental truth for all Jews and all Christians. There is only one God, and He is the creator of everything, the physical universe, the angels and the spiritual realm, humankind, us, all of us. And the account in Genesis 1 continues with this repeated refrain. "And God said, 'Let there be,' and there was." The God of Israel, the only God there is, Yahweh, spoke. And what He spoke burst into being. And through His word, the heavens and the earth and all that filled them came into existence. Every Jewish person understood this from childhood. And every God-fearing Gentile who had come into the church had been taught it as well. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And He had done that through speaking forth His word. John had been thinking about this for a long time, pondering what the Holy Spirit had been illuminating to his mind as he meditated on the Scriptures. In the beginning. Yes, the beginning of the story of Jesus did not start when John had first met Him. It did not start with Jesus' youth or with His childhood. It started in eternity. For what 50 years of walking with the risen Christ had taught John was that the man he had met by the Jordan River was no mere mortal. Yes, he was fully human. Jesus had proved that to them repeatedly, and John would have to be sure to make that clear when he told his story. Especially because there were so many now who were claiming to have secret revelations from Jesus. Nothing more than fraudulent and foolish nonsense spouted by liars who wanted attention and power. They could not be allowed to disrupt what Jesus had begun or to distort His message by misrepresenting who He was and what He said. The enemy's lies must not go unchallenged. The disciples needed to hear the truth and have a foundation on which they could stand, especially now that He was the last of the apostles still living, still teaching, still proclaiming what He had seen and heard and touched of the Word of life who came from the Father. In the beginning. In the beginning, children. In the beginning was the Logos, the Word. Speaking of God as the Logos, who was in the beginning, was a stroke of divinely inspired genius. All of the Jews would instantly think of God speaking the creation into existence. But it also made sense to the Greek-speaking Gentiles who were part of the church. Because the Greek word logos itself meant word, as in a discourse or a speech, a word. But logos could also mean reason, the capacity for logical thought, the ability to construct a coherent system of beliefs. And Greek philosophers thought of the logos as the structuring reality of the universe, that which held the universe together and which allowed us to comprehend the world around us in a way that was coherent with how it actually was. This is where we have to start, says John, if we want to understand the story of Jesus. We must go back to the very beginning of human history, before that even, to the beginning of the creation itself. For before anything was created, there was only one reality, and that was God himself. And this Logos, the Word of God, the one through whom everything and everyone was created, was himself fully divine. The Logos was God, one with him, indivisibly united with God, not a separate being, but eternally and fully one. And yet he was also with God. And the phrase there means face to face, in closest proximity to, in closest relationship to God. The Logos was fully God, yet also in relationship with God, with the Father. He was, according to John, the only begotten God, the Son who is God himself, who is also in the bosom of the Father, in the closest relationship with the Father, and therefore able to be distinguished from the Father, but not separate from him, not separable from him. And this is where John's story starts, at its most crucial point. For all of the miracles that will be narrated in his gospel, all of the extensive discourses and teaching of Jesus, all of the significance of the prophecies that are fulfilled, the significance of his life and his death, depend on one fundamental and inescapable truth. Jesus, the Messiah of Israel, was not just a holy man, not an inspired prophet or a brilliant rabbi. He was the only begotten Son of the Father, the Logos through whom the universe and all it contained was created. And he became human and lived among us for a time in order to reveal who God really was and what he was really like. You must understand this fundamental truth if you want to rightly understand John's story about Jesus. That means that the importance of John's gospel for the Christmas story, especially these 18 verses of introduction in chapter 1, cannot be overstated. Because the importance of John's gospel, especially these 18 verses of introduction in chapter 1, cannot be overstated for the entirety of Christian faith, the gospel message, and genuinely Christian theology. If you don't understand what John is saying in these 18 verses, not only will you misunderstand John's story, you can't understand Christianity or Christian faith or the Christmas story, not rightly. Nothing is more central or more important to Advent, to Christmas, to Christian faith than the recognition of what we know as the Incarnation, God becoming human in the person of his unique Son, Jesus of Nazareth. And nowhere is this more clearly and powerfully stated than in this portion of John's Gospel. But there's another important part of John's story that we don't want to miss today in these verses. I mentioned that John very clearly stated his purpose in writing his Gospel. He wanted to present evidence, particularly the evidence from Jesus' miracles, that would persuade the readers to recognize Jesus for who he was and to place their faith in him as Messiah and Lord. And so he begins his gospel by starting to lay out some of that evidence. In this case, the evidence of testimony from reliable witnesses. And his own eyewitness testimony is, of course, the very first bit of evidence he offers. Though John is, shall we say, suitably subtle, as befits an elder speaking to his family. John did not need to trumpet his accomplishments every time he speaks or to constantly remind those who are listening how very important he is, as is the case so often today. As one of the 12, he carries immediate respect and immense authority among the believers, along with immense responsibility as well. The word of Abba John has inherent authority, and he knows this. And he only mentions it when it's needed to assure those who are not within the church who are reading this, those who are outside, that what he's telling them is truthfully reported by an eyewitness. But everywhere throughout his gospel, John assumes that the church, the believers who are hearing it, they understands and acknowledges his authority as an apostle of Christ to declare truthfully what Jesus did and taught his followers to believe. And the first witness that John will call to add to his own voice is that of another man with the same name, John the Baptist. He was, in John's simple description, a man sent from God. Three things are important to note about this brief statement of fact. Number one, John the Baptist was a man, a human being and nothing else. And that's notable because he's contrasted with the one who was Logos, himself God, and yet not distinguishable from God. Who was God and yet distinguishable from God. John the Baptist was not divine. He was simply a man. He was named. Secondly, though, he did carry God's own testimony. John the Baptist had God's approval, and what he said, therefore, had the same weight as if God himself had spoken it. It actually makes a fun little puzzle of authority if you start thinking about it. The word of John, the gospel writer, vouches for John the Baptist and his words, which were spoken at the direction of the Logos, who is God's own word, and he is giving testimony on behalf of the Logos, all of which comes from God himself with his implicit or explicit authority. It's an interesting chain. Third, then, John the Baptist was sent from God. He was given a mission and a message to deliver from God to God's people, in fact, to anyone who would listen to what God had to say through this prophet. He was a well-known historical figure called to give evidence. Now, John's account about John the Baptist's testimony is going to continue right after this introduction finishes in verse 18. We do get a brief, very powerful example in verse 15. John the Baptist declares Jesus' pre-existence, that he was before I was. But the majority of his testimony is going to follow in the rest of chapter 1. But John does give us here three more salient facts about John the Baptist as sort of a resume of sorts, why he qualifies to be called as an expert witness in this case. First of all, he says he was not himself the light of God. The living truth that could illuminate the minds of people was not John the Baptist. That was someone else. John the Baptist's purpose in life, secondly, was to come and bear witness to the light of God, to identify and testify on behalf of the one who was the light of God. And then thirdly, his testimony was intended to provide evidence that would allow everyone who hears him to believe in the one who was the light of God, the Messiah of Israel, God himself, who would come into the world. Now, John then makes a special point in the introduction at this point in the narrative. It's a tactical point of admission, a tactical move, if you will, in his argument. He makes a very crucial admission that the Logos, the one who created the world and everything in it, came into the world, was in the world, and yet was not recognized by the world. More importantly, he came to his own home, to his own people, to those who should have recognized and accepted him and welcomed him, but they rejected him instead. They refused to acknowledge him, the light of God, and thus remained in darkness, blinded by their own unbelief. What John will go on to demonstrate in the rest of his gospel is that this blindness was not due to the failing of God, but to the refusal of his people to see what he had put right in front of their eyes. John will present the evidence of the miracles, the evidence of the testimony of God-sent prophets, the evidence of Jesus' own words. But he freely admits, and in fact he even highlights the fact, that there were many who didn't believe. And he doesn't do that to mock them or to scorn them, but to clarify what it means to believe and to show that the blindness of those who disbelieve is their own fault, not God's. And his readers, therefore, need to pay attention so they don't fall into the trap of unbelief themselves. And then comes this positive message. Some good news that's available to those who will believe. The light of God, the Logos, the Son of God, who has come into the world, is going to give them a unique opportunity, a privileged status that is only possible through believing and receiving Jesus the Messiah. And that status is to be known as children of God. By the way, when you hear people say, we're all children of God, you have to ask, what do you think you mean by that? Because Jesus says there is a group, the children of God, who are only the children of God the only part of the people who are born of God by the Spirit. They and they alone are given eternal life, and they alone are delivered from the darkness that is the world and enter into the light of God. They and they alone have the privilege of knowing God rightly as Father and taking their place among His family. This distinction between the world and the believers, what we know as the church, those who are called by the name of Christ, who identify with Him, give their allegiance to Him, and are spiritually united to Him through faith. Well, that distinction is one that John is going to highlight throughout his gospel and the letters that he wrote at approximately the same time. And the world is not just the physical planet. It's not even another way to describe human society. It is, in John's language, the realm of all of those who do not believe, who are born but not born again. They're enclosed by darkness, and only the believers live in the light, which is synonymous with living according to the teaching of Jesus Christ as His disciple. John makes this point often and strongly. He wants his readers, he wants us to understand that there's a difference between being around God and belonging to Him. There's a difference between knowing about God and knowing Him rightly. There's a difference between hearing the testimony about Christ and receiving it and believing it, placing the weight of your life on it, and building your life upon it. John knew that there were plenty of opponents of Christian faith. In the closing years of his life, when he wrote this gospel, he lived and ministered in and around the city of Ephesus. Ephesus had a very large and hostile population of Jews who refused to countenance the idea that Jesus was the Messiah, that God had become human in Jesus. There was an even larger and equally hostile population of pagans who refused to countenance the idea that there was only one God, a God who had not only become human but had died. And neither of those groups wanted anything to do with these Christians who believed their God and their Messiah had died on a cross. But John insists, it's not enough to recognize that there's a God or that He created the world if you don't also recognize that He came into His world in the person of Jesus. It's not enough to acknowledge that there is light and darkness if you do not also recognize your need to leave the darkness and come into the light. And that the only way you can do that is by receiving the light through believing in the only one who is the light of God Himself. It's not enough to be one of God's people by birth as a descendant of Abraham if you are not also born of the Spirit and made new by God Himself. So as we begin Advent, let's be clear about what it is we're remembering, what we're celebrating, and what we're cherishing. Let's be clear about the meaning of Christmas and why we think it is important. Our Christmas story is not one of sentimentality or the fulfillment of romantic dreams. It isn't a story about warm feelings of children and family and hot cocoa and fireplaces. There isn't any Christmas magic that suddenly transforms cranky and self-centered curmudgeons into saintly gift givers when they hear Mariah Carey or Michael Bublé sing a Yuletide song. Our Christmas message is not that every story has a happy ending. It is not that every broken heart will be made well, or that every family is going to sing around the Christmas tree like the Who's in Whoville, embrace one another without any strife, and go to bed thinking pleasant thoughts about the world. If only we just believe in elves who want to bring us gifts in secret, or in the power of make-believe to bring peace on earth. No, we have a very different message. We have a message that's not tied to heartwarming stories and popular legends, but to a story that turned the world inside out and upside down. Our Christmas story is the story of the light of God coming into the darkness of this world and the darkness of our own souls to rescue us from our self-induced blindness and give us true life. And John's gospel puts it straight to us. John's message for us this Christmas can be summarized fairly simply. If you thought you knew who God is and what He's like apart from knowing Him through the revelation of the Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth, you have completely missed it. Completely missed the point. No one, he says, has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. Christmas means that you can know God personally and rightly. The Son has come. His name is Jesus the Messiah. The Messiah of Israel, the Logos of God, the living Word of God, the light of the world. And He alone reveals God rightly. He alone is God in human flesh. He alone can save you. And He can reveal the truth to you. He can give you life. He can reconcile you to the Father. Because He is God Himself, full of grace and truth, who has come to bring us light and life.